This chapter, Chapter 5, deals with developmental disabilities. In prior editions of this book, it was referred to as mental retardation. We've evolved in the field away from the classification terminology mental retardation to developmental disabilities. It's not the first time that this condition has been so evolved as we talk about terminology. Developmental disabilities imply that a person has a lowered cognitive function, and as a result of various kinds of causes. And as you read through this chapter, you're going to see a dizzying array of those causes. I'm going to tell you to concentrate in terms of categories of causation, as opposed to remembering all the details about each specific condition. There are three components to the definition of the label developmental disabilities. The first is a significant impairment in cognitive function. And until the recent past, we've defined that almost solely on the basis of an IQ. When I first entered the field of education, that IQ cutoff was about 70, which represents 2 standard deviations below the mean on a standardized IQ test. We later have adjusted that definition, and currently that definition resides at about 75, which provides an area of expansion potentially based on the other 2 components. The second component is maladaptive behavior, or the absence of adaptive behavior. Adaptive behavior is a term we're going to run across consistently across the remaining chapters. It infers an ability to adapt to one's environment, to understand and exhibit those skills you need for communication, habilitation, orientation, mobility, self-care, etc. Maladaptive behavior means the presence of behaviors that are positively maladaptive in terms of, for example, some of the more extreme ones are self-mutilating behaviors, stereotypic tics. Those kinds of things are called maladaptive because they don't engender a comfort in the environment in which one operates. The third component is that the condition appeared during the developmental period from birth through the age of about 18 to 20. The reason for this is that there are several kinds of cognitive impairment that appear generally later. The most common one that you might be familiar with is Alzheimer's. It also results in diminished cognitive function and maladaptive or lack of adaptive behavior, as you probably know. Yet it isn't classified as a developmental disability because it occurs, generally speaking, after the developmental period. This chapter spends a great deal of time, as I mentioned, on causation. Another term for that is etiology. For purposes of your reading in this chapter, I suggest that you think about etiology in terms of when it occurs. When do causes occur? Normally we divide that into prenatal, which include various kinds of conditions that affect genetic and chromosomal development, intrauterine environments, and those potential traumatic causes that occur then. Perinatal, which means through the birth process, where a number of insults can occur, a number of trauma can occur to the infant being born. And finally, postnatal. There are insults and injuries that can occur after birth, including dramatic infections and high fevers that can engender a developmental disability. The other way that you can look at the defining differences of causation is where they originate. Many of the conditions that we think about as associated with developmental disabilities involve genetic and chromosomal abnormalities. The most common of these is a condition we refer to as Down's syndrome. Now, I don't like the term Down syndrome. It was invented in the 19th century by a British physician named Thomas Downs, and he described it as a racial degeneration and indicated that it was a reduction of ability associated with moving from Caucasian to Mongoloid racial structures. Obviously, that is incorrect, and it also ignores the fact that Down syndrome occurs in all racial groups. There are teratogenic causations for developmental disabilities, and it can occur in all three of the time periods, pre, peri, and postnatal. Teratogens are a Greek name which means mutation causing. The most common one in my young life was exposure of the mother during gestation periods to German measles or rubella. Rubella is in fact a very mild infection, but if encountered by the mother and passed along to the fetus during the first 3 months of pregnancy, causes enormous numbers of potential genetic malformations. So, we can also look at traumatic injuries to the fetus, also including things like cerebral palsy, oxygen deprivation or hypoxia during birth or slightly after birth, exposure to various chemical agents, and even exposure to naturally occurring infections such as meningitis. Those are traumatic injuries to the brain which result not necessarily in cognitive disabilities, but potentially in those as well as other motoric and other kinds of disabilities that we might observe. There's lots of medical information in the chapter, and I have tried to maintain a relatively small amount of those in the quiz that you'll be taking. There are a few that are relatively unavoidable. Knowing what certain kinds of disabilities like Down syndrome, which is also called trisomy 21, knowing that that's the most common one. But even given all of that information in the chapter, the vast majority of students who have developmental disabilities have a causation we cannot determine. If we could cure or prevent all forms of developmental disabilities for which we know the cause, we would still have the majority of students with that condition remaining. So, the other thing that I want you to pay attention to in the chapter is the gradual movement away from testing as sole means of determining cognitive function. As a matter of fact, in the most recent definitions that you'll read in the chapter, we try not to categorize developmental disabilities by severity of cognitive function measured by IQ. We used to say, well, if you had an IQ of 70, you were mildly developmentally disabled. Now, we try to classify by the amount of time and energy and the extent of intervention required, so that those people with the most severe forms of developmental disability have pervasive need for intervention. Good luck, and keep your science on for this chapter.